Welcome everyone to the pre-quarters of Australs. Yay! We'll do our pronoun introductions. You're not obligated to provide a preferred pronoun. If teams could do that in their speaking order, that would be perfect. My panel and I will go first. I'm Fraser, my pronouns are she, her.
I'm Ellie, any pronouns are fine.
I'm Hans, they them please.
I am Omar, also they them.
Young, no preferred pronoun.
Cool, I'm Rose, I'm speaking first. For reply, my preferred pronouns are she, her.
Eleanor speaking second, she, they.
And Liv speaking third.
Asia speaking first to reply, she, her.
Grace second, she, they.
Harper, she, they.
Cool. Sorry, can I just get the speaking order again?
Yep, so Rose speaking first in reply, then Eleanor speaking second, and Liv speaking third.
Thank you.
Asia speaking first to reply, Grace speaking second, Harper speaking third.
All right. Thank you so much. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the first affirmative speaker.
Wait, sorry. So we're debating motion number 2. What are the vetoes?
Both vetoed.
Okay.
Which one?
Number 3.
Great, just doing the table shuffle.
So good thinking for this bigger table.
I know, I was kind of like, oh, maybe in the out rounds we'll get a real table. Yeah,
Can we
I
just
just
check the
close.
door in the hallway? Whichever one's missing a key card.
That's fine.
I think you just close it.
I think it might be the one next door. Do you want me to just close the door?
Yeah, maybe if you could do it, that would be great.
That noise is really. When the international community is faced with a series of pressing and important problems and is given the opportunity to trade off efficient and good development, both environmentally and socially, with inefficient and patchy development that is likely to disadvantage the most oppressed people, obviously you ought prioritise efficient and good environmental and social development. What am I going to do for you in this speech? Firstly, 3 contributions in setup, then 2 substantive points. The first is on why we get the best direct spend for environmental protection and development. The second is why we get significantly better and more inclusive social development. First of all, in setup then, what does side affirmatives stand for in this debate? Firstly, we stand for the amount of money that is currently allocated towards climate co-benefits going directly into the Climate Investment Fund. Note that this means that the base level that is spent on social projects is the same. The climate dollars are pooled and therefore put into the Climate Investment Fund. Secondly, we would point to the fact that the Climate Investment Fund goes to things that are dedicated to ameliorating and mitigating the impacts of climate change. This was things like helping countries change their energy grids and their inputs, but also adapt to the impacts of climate change, particularly those that developing nations are likely to be particularly exposed to. This was things like building seawalls, engaging in soil regeneration in order to facilitate biodiversity, building large solar plants and wind farms, and researching into things like seed and other kinds of crop development. Note that a lot of these projects were incredibly expensive, but also incredibly important for a lot of these developing nations. Secondly then, what does side negative have to stand for in this debate? We would argue that they're standing for the status quo, which is to say that every time the World Bank approves a project of development, a proportion of that money has to be allocated to climate development. This was things like things being allocated to climate vulnerable areas in terms of priority, doing things like training modules and sort of general green construction principles. But thirdly, note in this debate that side negative cannot say that side affirmative is now going to build a bunch of carbon-guzzling infrastructure that's built in an incredibly unsustainable way. There are a couple of empirical reasons for this. The first thing is simply that sustainable principles are often the most cost efficient. That was to say that if you built a hospital that had good insulation, or a building that had good insulation, you didn't need to spend as much money heating or cooling that building. That was likely to be better for the environment in terms of energy input and output, but was also likely to just reduce your overall operating costs. Note that these things often are normalized over time. That's why we're seeing a normalization of sustainable construction and development, because developers and climate specialists can understand that it is the most sustainable way to do things on a variety of different levels. Secondly, because obviously there is still going to be large pressure and scrutiny on foreign direct investment infrastructure projects, that was things like where the World Bank was allocating its money. It was likely that those institutions would still be scrutinized and would still have pressure on them to act in sustainable ways. But thirdly, note that there are just norms of sustainability and the kinds of foreign direct investment or other forms of foreign investment that these institutions do. This was things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which the vast majority of international institutions have signed up to, but also that a lot of these institutions just have organizational cultures that are likely to prioritize sustainability and green development. Note that that means that we are likely to get relatively low energy consuming things like co-ops and schools, which means that even when the projects are not above and beyond in terms of what they do to attempt to mitigate the impacts of climate change, they are incredibly unlikely to be harmful, but that in the very small set of cases where they are likely to be somewhat environmentally damaging, this is because very little could actually be done to offset their environmental impact. Note that this is a burden that side negative also cannot meet, and therefore that set of examples falls out of the debate. First set of substantive contributions then, why we get the best direct spend for environmental protection. Firstly, just a quick contextual note on why the amount of financing afforded to these projects is likely to remain the same. Proving this proves that this debate is now about a question of efficient allocation. So, note just crucially that there were a bunch of reasons that developed countries donated to the World Bank that were likely to be separate to allocation. We would note that countries obviously still donate to things like the IMF, despite the fact that it often does not directly spend that money, because firstly, there are a bunch of reputational benefits for doing things like donating to international institutions, particularly if you were a developed country that was sometimes blamed for the impetus of climate change, and therefore you felt you had a reputational, at the very least, responsibility to be perceived as benevolent. But secondly, because there were just a bunch of institutional benefits to donating to those kinds of organizations that meant that you were likely to still want to be involved, even if you did not have direct control over where that money was likely to be allocated, particularly if you knew it was going into something that was directly dedicated to climate change, something like the CIF. Note that at that point then, we prove that you do not reduce the money, you just change the allocation of it. Firstly then, why does the Climate Investment Fund need more money? And note that if we prove that we can get cheaper, more effective funding that is likely to alleviate the suffering of the people who are the worst impacted by climate change, we win this debate. First reason that it needs more money then, because often the projects that it aims to achieve are incredibly expensive and central. These were not putting solar panels on roofs, these were things like building kilometres long seawalls that needed to be long, strong and constantly repairable. But secondly, because often R&D just required large amounts of upfront capital. That was to say that you could not get research into things like the sustainable development of rice, which was incredibly pressing and needed in a lot of Asian countries, without large amounts of upfront capital that could be invested into that project, which needed to be directly allocated. Secondly, because often these big projects were just the most effective. Why was that? Firstly, because when they were centralized, they were likely to be significantly less trivial. That was to say that putting a solar panel on every single building needed a great deal of upkeep, but also had limited impact without addressing the real problems. The direct issues that people impacted by climate change in Bangladesh are facing are flooding, are a lack of seawall protection, are a lack of any kind of amelioration of the very, very direct and extreme harms of climate change. But secondly, because obviously when you engage in the large-scale construction of these kinds of things, you can engage in economies of scale. That was to say that you could buy construction materials in bulk. You could do these things on mass levels that were likely to decrease their overall cost. Contrast this to what side affirmative has to do, which is fund these measures in individual projects that mean that they cannot access those economies of scale. But thirdly, because often the teams that will working on these kinds of larger scale, more impactful projects were likely to be directly skilled and trained in things like climate-based construction, in things like ameliorating the impacts of climate change, rather than in general sustainable, like in general human development. But fourthly, because these big projects just had the widest spread impact. That was to say that perhaps if you lived in a local area that now had some buildings on it that had more solar panels, maybe you benefited from there being more energy in the energy grid. But if you could in fact invest in Kenya's carbon capture potential in order for it to capture significantly higher levels of carbon from the atmosphere, now everybody in that country but also in the world could literally benefit from the change in funding, the change in allocation. That was incredibly important. But lastly, because often these big projects were the most needed, that was to say that these developing countries were ravaged by the impacts of climate change. They needed direct and large mitigation and help now. This was things like seawalls, this was things like large solar farms, this was things like improving your capacity to cope with things like internal climate refugee issues. Note that the end point of this is that we get climate benefits that are firstly cheaper because you can engage in them in economies of scale. Note that that is an iterative benefit because the cheaper that they are, the more incentivized you are to do more of them. But secondly, climate change address measures that were likely to be significantly more effective. But thirdly, that were just likely to directly alleviate the suffering that people in these nations experienced as a result of climate change. That was incredibly important because when you are weighing this debate panel, it is incredibly important that you remember that the people who are affected by climate change in these countries are people whose lives are being destroyed, who are being ravaged, who are being flooded and burned out of their homes. At the end of all of that, I've never been prouder to propose.
First affirmative. I'd now like to welcome the first negative speaker.
Development is only as worthwhile as the long-term returns it can give. And if we are building schools without solar panels on them that cannot power themselves in the future and are likely to shut down, that reduces equitable access to development all across the world and locks developing countries into a much harder shift in the future when they're unable to buy the more expensive unrenewable products. Two things in this speech. Firstly, why development is likely to get far, far worse. And secondly, why allocating more money to the Climate Investment Fund is inefficient to solve the problems of climate change. Firstly, why development projects get far, far worse. The first thing we're going to explain to you in this point is why, if there's no dedicated co-adaptation approach, why it's unlikely development projects will be environmentally friendly. The first thing we have to say is that the structure of the World Bank is donor-driven. It gives out loans or sometimes grants, and the big countries that provide this money want to have, one, efficient projects, but secondly, projects that are as cheap as possible. That's because these projects are needed now, they need to service a lot of people, and they want high returns on investment. That's why just having a norm of sustainability or having large amounts of scrutiny is not enough to overcome these large financial incentives that act on developed countries, because they do not care about sustainability in other countries as long as their voters do not create a voter incentive on themselves. Often voters are not putting large amounts of pressure on them on development projects that are built overseas. I think those norms do not stand up enough to overcome the financial incentives on developing countries on how they provide that money to donate to development projects building overseas. The next thing they say here, though, is, oh, but it's actually, sustainable and cost efficient to build development projects. That's one, only in a long run sense, but two, only in a sense for the user. It is actually often cheaper right now to build things to build using unsustainable projects, and that's because they've been developed for a really long time. They have economies of scale from producing them because we have infrastructure that's been built for years. Comparatively, solar panels use really difficult resources to get, like large amounts of lithium, for example. That drives the cost up significantly for those. I think it's not sustainable to build them in the short term. They don't have a financial incentive on their side of the house there. But the last thing to say here is that even if all of that is true and these projects are still likely to be sustainable, we contend that you get less development projects overall, and that is a significant harm you must weigh in this debate. Because secondly here, given that every time you do a project now, you have to pay a proportion of that project to the Climate Investment Fund, the amount of capital you have to spend on each project rises significantly. Because now you still have to have the money to fund the project as well as the money to give to the Climate Investment Fund, which means that either you get less environmentally projects done so that they can cut the cost to make those projects the same amount of cost as they would be because you're substituting building solar panels with building something else, or you do less projects overall because the World Bank no longer has the capital to fund as many projects as all. I think that's incredibly bad for 3 reasons. Firstly, development needs to be for the future. So if you accept that development is likely to become less environmentally friendly, more focused on the short term, climate change adaptations are the only way to be able to future-proof this investment that is incredibly important. That looks like building schools that have access to renewable energy in the future when non-renewable energy is likely to become far more expensive in the future, far more likely to price developing countries out, and never give them access to schools that become obsolete when they cannot turn the lights on. Secondly, though, that's a huge waste of investment overall. If you're building stuff that becomes obsolete, that's a huge amount of just general unsustainable principles that you poured into building a school that will just sit there and not be able to do anything with it. I think that worsens the climate change overall. Thirdly, though, we have a principal obligation to protect these countries because they have the least current protections against climate change, and we think that worsens when you continue to build unsustainable infrastructure to them. It's going to be far less affordable for them to develop in the future, to switch, when that switch is far more priced up because there's huge amounts of demand on that switch to switching to renewable energy. It's far more important they do that now with development projects. But lastly, we think it's hardest for developing countries to have an incentive to do this type of development themselves. That's because, one, they prioritise their more proximate needs. Like, they're more interested in getting education out to large amounts of children than they are about putting solar panels on school. But secondly, they see this as a problem that is primarily caused by the West wanting to develop as fast as possible. And because they care about economics, because they care about growing their GDP and competing on a global stage and providing for citizens in their country, they are most incentivized by developing as well. They see it as their right to develop rather than solving a problem that the West has thrust upon them. I don't think they're likely to get development projects there. Next thing, why allocating more money to the Climate Investment Fund is inefficient to solve. The first thing I'm going to note at the start of this point is, to the extent that seawalls benefit all people, because all people do not want to be tsunamied, there is an incentive to do this on either side of the house, and that is probably where the Climate Investment Fund goes, on either side of the house. But as we explained to you, individual developers do not have the same incentive. I think you should prioritise getting development across the world more equitably in individual locations, given those large-scale projects will be done symmetrically regardless. Firstly here, we think that allocating more money to this fund is giving you diminishing returns because this is the world's largest fund already, and additional money that goes into this probably does not go into the most important projects. Note that all the projects Affirmative talked to you about, like changing energy grids and changing seawalls, have already happened, so will continue to happen on the negative side of the house. But we think these funds go into projects that are far more speculative, far more blue skies investment, and we think that's incredibly harmful because, one, it's unlikely or unclear how much benefit Affirmative can gain from that project if it's unclear if the technology will be able to get anything out of it. But secondly, we think it would be far more impactful, as we already explained to you, to do the stuff that we talked about in the first point. The next thing to say here is the fund still exists on our side of the house with a huge amount of capital. We still get a lot of that stuff anyway. The third thing to say is that we think the Climate Investment Fund is least likely to go to the developing world. Why is that? That's because voting in the World Bank is, one, given on basic votes for each country, but secondly, share votes that are based on how much money you contribute. And obviously, the developed world contributes the most amount of money because, one, they have the most spare money in the budget, so they have the capacity to do this, but secondly, they want the control over this bank. They want to know where the money they put in goes to it. That's their incentive there. And we think developed countries are likely to prioritize themselves because they need visibility to taxpayers and voters to justify giving that amount of money to the World Bank in these difficult times. Therefore, one, they want return for themselves, and secondly, they want something impressive. So when they talk to you about reputational benefits you get from donating, those only come when they're reputational benefits to your own constituents, and that's who you prioritize there, and they only come with it's really something big and flashy you can shout about to the rooftops. But the third thing to say here is that many countries are setting up their own climate change funds, so it's unclear why all this extra development has to go into the Climate Investment Fund in the World Bank. If you want blue skies investment, it's clear that that could be done just through the United States Climate Change Fund. It could be done through the European Union Climate Change Fund. I think that puts an incredible burden on affirmative that they have not substantiated yet. That why it isn't worth creating schools, creating infrastructure grids that are fundamentally unsustainable to the developing world, locking them out of development and equitable growth in the future for some blue skies projects that could have been done literally anywhere else.
Thank you. First negative, I'd now like to welcome the second affirmative speaker.
Apologies all for my voice. Alright. The majority of that speech was spent explaining to you why not putting a solar panel on a school is a really bad thing. The first thing I would point to is that obviously you can retrofit a solar panel onto a school. And I think this is particularly likely when we build more schools, because they tell you that they're going to make this more costly because on our side there's just an incentive to do this cheaper. I think that's a great thing. Now that means you just build more schools. And when you build more schools, you know what happens. More kids get educated. And then those kids who get educated can perhaps go to a university. And then even if only one child goes to a university and therefore earns a higher wage in future, they can go back to their community and pay for a solar panel to go into a school. They can, say, live long enough they're able to contribute to their community in other ways. Notice that all these externalities occurred on our side. You did not need to put money into that occurring. In fact, I would posit that it was just better to build more schools. In fact, it probably had better environmental outcomes. It probably was better for the environment in the long term if you were able to do things like list more women out of poverty, so they were able to do things like contribute in different ways, so they were able to live different lives. I think that is a reason why we're winning on their own metric. I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to deal with why we are the only side that gets the good environmental development, and then secondly, actually no, I'll deal with their push on inclusive development first, and then I'm going to deal with environmental development. Okay, let's deal with their stuff on social development. Essentially, they give you a couple of things here. The first is to say that if you take away the environmentally friendly, co-ops, like the double gains thing, that means that you're never going to do this in environmentally friendly ways, and that's going to make it worse in the long run. And the thing that I would point to here is, as I said in my introduction, if you believed in their best case that it was true, that there was an incentive to do this as cheaply as possible, and that their side is the only side that offset that, I think that just proves to you why we are able to get more projects, and we are able to do more for social development. And I know that this is a climate debate, but that doesn't mean that you should ignore the fact that we are therefore able to just alleviate more suffering, because I think on their side, they actually decrease the level of development and inclusive development that you are able to get. Because maybe now you only build a hospital in a climate-affected area. Maybe now you only build a school, as they tell you on the info side, they can't contest this, that you do this in the area that is the worst hit by climate change. But that ignores the fact that malaria is malaria wherever you go, that homelessness is homelessness wherever you go. That doesn't mean that you should not provide for these people, especially given that this was a fund that was specifically designed to cater to those people. They deserve to get the money for it. When we changed where the calculus said you should put that hospital, we literally changed who had access to those sorts of resources. I think that is a harm that they have to cop. But equally, I think we've also changed the way in which people are helped on their side. Because now you have to be thinking, every time you're thinking of a project, you're like, well, what's the project I can do where I can most easily add on a climate benefit? Maybe that's you build a building and you stick a solar panel on top. But that probably means you don't do things like give out microloans. That probably means you don't do things that could be easily co-opted into a climate change benefit, which means you significantly reduce the types of projects you engage in. That means that projects become less effective. That means you can't do as many of them. That means that you are literally just always going through reams of paperwork and administration every time you try to get a project off the ground. That means less dollars go to the people who need them the most. Less dollars go to actually improving people's lives. And as I pointed out in my introduction, the externalities of being able to improve people's lives are good for the environment. They are good for people. But equally, I just think that alleviating people's suffering probably should be an incredibly important thing in this debate, given that both teams seem to agree on it. But then what do they say? They say, oh no, but this is going to be bad in the long term, because if these projects aren't environmentally friendly and don't have solar panels, they're going to break down in the future. The first thing to say is that their own incentive about wanting to do this in a cost-effective way shows this is not how this is likely to accrue. Because if you knew that you were going to build something and then in 5 years it would be obsolete because you didn't do it in an environmentally friendly way, obviously the World Bank has no incentive to do it like that. I think the World Bank is probably not an idiotic institution. It probably has a lot of advisors who can say, well, if you build it like this, it's going to fail. Secondly, though, I think that looks terrible for the World Bank, right? Because at the point at which you have good actors who are providing for you, who care a lot about environmental damage right now, probably, and then you say, I built all these projects and they failed, that's a really bad look for you. That means you're likely to risk losing funding, which means there was never an incentive to do this in this way. But equally, as I tell you in my introduction, I think it's really easy for you to retrofit these sorts of things later. Given that it was in your profit incentive to build, say, buildings with insulation, because that literally decreased the amount of cost, it was much easier to hook it up to solar panels later on if you believed that was going to be something that was so expensive. If that was something that required a lot, I think that we were the side that was able to get that better when we did not just take away the solar panels on your roof. We built you a solar grid. We built you a solar farm. We built you a carbon capture facility that was literally able to offset these harms. They cannot say that we're just taking away. We are giving something incredibly important back. I think at the end of that then, we were the side that was able to meet people's immediate needs if you cared the most about social development here. Because we were the side that opened that up to the people who needed it the most, not just the people who were affected by climate change. We were the people who used those dollars in the most effective sense. Their entire first push doesn't exist in this debate. Let's deal next then with the environmental benefits, because I think we're clearly pulling ahead on this since we give you a lot of analysis of rows that gets unresponded to. Essentially what they tell you is that it isn't going to be good for the environment because the large-scale projects are being done anyway and there's going to be diminishing returns. The first thing to say here is that I actually would flip this, and I would say that when you have less money in the climate investment fund, that money probably goes to worse places or more elite places. Let me give you an intuition hub for this. If you can only afford to build 10 kilometers of seawall, that 10 kilometers of seawall are going to go to the place that's the most economically profitable, so it's going to protect the town that develops the most income for Bangladesh, rather than being extended to 15 or 20 or 30 kilometers of seawall that actually benefits more people, because now you don't just have an incentive to hoard that money into the most elite places, you actually have an incentive to broaden out that benefit and therefore get more people benefited by adaptation measures. Notice that it was the seawall that meaningfully changed people's lives, not just a solar panel on someone's roof. I think that having your house blown away by a flood was incredibly important. But the next thing that I would say here is simply just that when they say, oh, but you're doing it anyway, obviously they stand for the status quo. These things are not being done anyway. Kenya had the capacity to capture a majority of the carbon in the atmosphere, but it was not doing that because there was a lack of investment. These were not diminishing returns. You literally just needed huge amounts of money in order to have these sorts of developments because they were things that were expensive. They were tech heavy. They required a lot of specialists. They required you to centralize your resources. Compare that to that was not something you could do if you did not have large amounts of money. If you could extend that seawall by more and more kilometers, you saved more and more lives. That was a massive more benefit than just what they wanted to tell you where you trained up some people in something to do with climate change. But next, They tell you that developing countries are not going to be the ones who actually get this money, therefore it's bad. The first thing that I would say is that the World Bank existed for development, which meant that it was really unclear to me why it wouldn't just go into developed countries. But secondly, there were reasons why developing countries wanted that money to go into these places and to be used well. That was things like they didn't want climate refugees, they got economic benefits when places were being flooded, they got environmental benefits when they were able to have things around this. And they tell you then that the EU can just fund it itself, but obviously that's not necessarily how it works by their own analysis, because they don't have more of an incentive to be selfish themselves. But equally, I think that just broadening the pool is probably a massive benefit. If you believe that, I think it's probably more likely that people were like, oh, I'll pay for a solar panel to go onto onto the top of a school, because that was something that appealed really well to Westerners paying for charities. But saying something like putting money into a big fund, putting money into a big project was something that required specific investment. Notice then that they ignore all the information that we give you at Rose about why decentralised funding is actually really ineffective. And I think that this is something you should rate really highly in this debate, because obviously if we were able to get more effective use of money, that was where the money should go. It was more direct, it was more beneficial, it was better use of it. But we tell you that this is because these issues are simply too big, because you cannot fix climate change with these sort of small piecemeal things that they tell you. In fact, I would say that these are particularly ineffective measures, because notice here, there's no cohesive approach to this. I build a school, I go, how can I make this environmentally friendly? Oh, I'll do this thing. I build a farm. I go, how can I make this more environmentally friendly? I'll do this thing. That means you get a solar panel here, a training project here, a something else here. There is no goal to this. There's no cohesive strategy, which means that even if you believe that each of those got a small amount of return, they never build on each other. They're never able to actually create long-term change, because they're simply just trivial things that you've added on top in order to tick a box on a scheme. That was the point at which you were not able to get meaningful change to people's lives that alleviated their suffering. I'm so proud to propose.
Is it okay if I turn the aircon on?
Yeah, it's really quite hot in here.
I was going to leave then, so it's not too bad. Yes.
Thank you. Second affirmative. I'd like to welcome the second negative speaker.
issues in my speech. Firstly, assuming that both sides have equal contributions towards environmental spending, which kind is more efficient? Secondly, does this policy reduce the funding of the CIF? And thirdly, will development projects become less sustainably friendly, and the implications of that environmentally and socially? So, firstly, which kind of spending is more efficient, assuming that there's no change in funding? What we tell you is that the voting structure and the way that the World Bank works means that developed countries have entrenched power within these systems, and that means that they tend to use this money for their own benefit. So even if there are 6 reasons why it's more efficient to have more money, which I will dispute later, that money is going to be spent in developed countries instead of overseas, right? They're going to build seawalls in Florida rather than Bangladesh. What do we hear? We hear no direct response at second to any of our incentives about self-interest, but how in this economic climate, voters in America are looking to their government for justification for why they're pouring heaps of money into funds that might not be directly contributing to them when people in their country are suffering economically and environmentally with extreme weather events, and how they need to show themselves as being good. What we do here are a series of independent mechanisms which I'll deal with now. What we hear is firstly that they're scared of having climate refugees, and secondly that there are economic benefits to helping developing nations. Several responses here. Firstly, not every single country is affected by climate refugees, right? Like it's unlikely that the US is going to be affected by climate refugees from Bangladesh, which is the only example that AF seems to care about in this debate. So it's not sure that this incentive applies to everybody, every big developed country. Secondly, those economic benefits also do not apply because it's unclear why every Western country is trading with these particular vulnerable nations, right? It's unclear, they don't show us why that's true. But also, I think the main problem with this is that the West thinks that the solutions they're proposing will help, right? They think that, blue skies technology and building seawalls is the best way to help climate change. And they think that that development is going to be the big solution. The problem is they do that at the expense of, policies which we think can be meaningfully helpful, right? It's not just having solar panels, it's actually doing things to help farmers, you train them how to be, train hospitals how to run more economically friendly, all the examples Aisha gave you. We think that they're dismissive of it in the exact same way the affirmative team is, and that leads them to naively underestimate the impact of that and avoid funding it in comparison to things that they think are technologically advanced, that look good because they're at the pinnacle of science, and those things will probably not pay off for a very long time. Why is that? Well, it's because all the 6 reasons that we hear at first stats about why the spending is going to be really efficient just aren't true, right? Firstly, just note most of those mechanisms are just missed reasons why you need more money, but we tell you that the CAF already has a reasonably large pool of money, right? They're the largest climate fund in the world. So all the things they need, like upfront capital, like attracting the most intelligent minds, you can already achieve with the amount of money they have. But in terms of economies of scale, those economies of scale don't get drastically bigger when you add another, 100 million, right? So ultimately we think they don't manage to significantly increase the progress of the CAF and making huge technological advancements towards these huge, faraway, aspirational goals, which are probably not going to be able to directly help people now. And even if they do, that funding is going to be spent in developing nations rather than developing. Moving on now, though, to if the CAF fund is reduced, because we actually think it is. The structure of the World Bank means that donations are voluntary, because big countries with voting power don't want to sink money in. So what do? They make those donations in the form of loans, right? So if they can't get their money back, if they feel like these loans aren't going to be returned because these projects aren't as environmentally friendly, they're going to have to have more money put into them at a later point, they're probably going to choose to withdraw their funding and put it into projects that directly help them more, or the funds that they've set up nationally. So what does that mean? That means that the exact mechanisms that the affirmative team gives you, like having a reputational benefit, like the fact it benefits themselves, they can more easily achieve if they pour their money into other things, right? For example, if they choose to withdraw their money from the World Bank and put it into their own national climate fund or to an EU climate fund or something like that, that provides reputational benefits because it still shows that they're helping in a very important issue. It's unclear why the West necessarily cares about the developing world more than themselves. But secondly, they benefit themselves, which is the exact reasons that the affirmative team wanted to point to when they talk about economic benefits. So ultimately, I think that means that it's likely that in a world where they don't, receive direct benefits, they're probably going to, change the way they donate to the World Bank. That means they vote differently, they reduce the spending that the CAF has. That also should be weighed against the affirmative team in this debate because it means they're putting less towards environmentally friendly infrastructure. But moving on now to developing projects if they become less sustainably friendly. And I think this is just something the affirmative team fundamentally misunderstands, right? Let's just clarify. In a world where you have the affirmative team's policy, you have to spend the exact same amount of money to build that project. And so that's because you're giving away maybe 10% or 20% of your project funding to the CIF. You have less money then to build your project. So you can't then just put all this money into solar panels and put all of it into doing all the same things that we're trying to do because you don't have the money for it. You have to save money somehow because you've got less money directly for your project. Where does that money get saved? It gets saved on the environmental benefits that they wanted to talk about. But to claim that this doesn't happen, they say that this is going to be more sustainable anyways because you save on operating costs. But this never engages with what Aisha tells you in response, which is that developers don't benefit in the short term. But additionally, note that by the time you've maybe improved your GDP, which is very speculative and far off, you are going to be in the process of repaying a loan to the World Bank. So it's unclear why you're in a position to significantly upgrade the infrastructure of your country. So they definitely cannot co-opt our benefits. In terms of the other mechanisms they give us, which are that this is at a norm and it will be scrutinised, these don't apply. Firstly, because the norm will depend on the country and the people who work in that country, and empirically and for structural reasons, like the fact that there have been less resources in these countries historically, that means they're less likely to have a norm of being environmentally friendly, they're more likely to not use infrastructure, to not use the most advanced technology. And in terms of scrutiny, you probably don't have as much direct scrutiny just because people aren't, having these norms affecting them, they're not looking, and this geographical distance between where the development is taking place and the sorts of people who do care about these incentives. So that probably means that there's no scrutiny and that doesn't apply. What does this mean in this debate? Firstly, we think it means it's bad for the environment. Like Aisha said, right, these things can have hugely impactful benefits for people right now. You don't have to wait for them to make a technological breakthrough that might, be 10 years or 20 years away for you to actually realise the benefits of your thing. what they tell you is they set up an urgent issue. They say people are drowning now, they're at risk of flooding right now. We are the only team that can effectively help those people who are trying to reduce, climate emissions immediately. But also, we think that, they're unable to realise as much social development, because obviously if they want to choose to spend more on environmental stuff to claim their benefits, then they can't get to build as many projects, which is what they want to claim. And then they fail on all their benefits they talk about when they talk about how they're going to build all these hospitals and all these schools. Final thing I want to talk about is something new that comes out at Second Ave, which is that they'll only choose to spend on projects which are easy to make environmentally friendly, because that's the best way to get the most out of your spending. That is also not true, right? Because that's just not how the World Bank works. Countries come and they request money to pay for specific projects that they want to do, and then the World Bank looks at how they can fund that, what sort of conditions they put on that development. It's unclear why they're necessarily going to choose projects that aren't as needed when they firstly view development as one of their mission statements. We tell you that in a world where you don't tie development and environment, people make poor decisions because they're not cognizant of development goals when they're looking at the environment. That's something we prevent.
Thank you. Second negative, I'd like to welcome the third affirmative speaker.
I think it is really troubling for this negative team to never have truly engaged with the depth and scale of massive investment into projects that have huge economies of scale, that have huge network and team connectivity benefits, that can make massive changes to people's lives. Because we were willing to trade off, a trade-off I don't think we actually have to make, but I will explain a bit later. We're willing to trade off maybe a couple less dollars going into these funds if they were being used vastly more efficiently. We were happy to spend like 20% less, which I really don't think we have to do, on solar panels on schools, which make a negligible impact on the environment, which have negligible benefits to the people who use those schools. Because, oh my god, we're not in peak oil, we're not going to run out of unsustainable fuel in the immediate future if it meant that we got less people dying of like famines because rice productivity was dropping in Southeast Asia, and it was vital that we put millions, if not billions of dollars into researching it and fixing it, because otherwise people will starve to death much more immediately than those schools might run out of power, and I think much more certainly than people were going to pull their money out of the World Bank and out of these climate projects.
3 questions in this speech. Firstly, how does the flow of money change into this investment fund and into the way it spends? Secondly, on environmental benefits, and thirdly, on social development. Firstly, on the flow of money. They tell us voters are concerned, their first claim on this is that voters are concerned about the amount of money that the World Bank is spending, and so for some reason, if they start spending it on climate investment in developing countries in a more direct way rather than a more inefficient way, which is their side, they're going to want to pull their money out. Firstly, please consider if you have met anyone in their entire lives who has ever changed their vote based on what their government is spending, like sending to the World Bank. Like, come off it, please. People are worried about gun control. They are worried about abortion. They are worried about healthcare. This does not change anyone's perspective on anything. But even if you think that there are some bureaucratic wonks who are like, oh, fuck this, like, I really like solar panels on schools and hospitals. I hate seawalls and I hate preventing people from dying. Okay, maybe that happens to an incredibly minimal extent, but I think that the West actually does get much more direct benefits from these major investment projects than they do from small schools, small hospitals, or even from like training farmers how to use seeds better. That is, if you build gigantic carbon capture and storage facilities in Kenya, everyone in the world benefits because the world is less likely to like overheat and have lots of people die. But also, if you build incredibly efficient projects, I think that satisfies like bureaucratic wonk interests a bit more because they're able to see a more direct benefit. They tell us this means, okay, we're now going to spend a lot of money on like blue sky thinking because that seems really awesome and it's at the pinnacle of science. But I think this fails to engage with the fact that obviously people make somewhat rational calculations and that if they wanted to like throw a huge bunch of money into like ridiculous ideas, they'd probably be like privately investing in SpaceX or something like that, or some other equivalent country. They say, okay, well now you're going to fund things in your own countries. I think that obviously, like I've just explained, there's a huge benefit to projects wherever you fund them. So even if you think, like at our very worst case, that now they're going to build more like solar farms in like Australia, or they're going to build more carbon and capture storage things in the EU, that still benefits everyone in the entire world because there is less carbon in the atmosphere, and I think that is probably a good thing. But also I think it's really likely that if you're giving money to a development bank, like the World Bank, you're not going to immediately pull it out and be like, hey, like, oh my god, I love my like friends down the road in the EU, and I'm going to put a huge amount of money there. But also, I think that we get quite glib and flippant responses to Eleanor's material about how climate refugees do actually matter to the West. Yes, maybe it is hard to get from Bangladesh to the USA, but Germany took in 1 million refugees as a direct consequence of climate change, which like precipitated instability in Syria and caused massive migration of people throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Obviously, they also benefit from trade because it's not just like a small number of examples, but this means countries like Vietnam, countries like China, countries like India have vastly more sustainable development. These are the manufacturing hubs of the world, and I think it is likely that the West still wants them to have significant benefits because if textile factories are being flooded across 40% of the landmass of Bangladesh all the time because there's not enough seawalls and there's really there's too much carbon in the atmosphere and all of these other things, I think it is likely that the West does experience material losses. So I don't think people are pulling their money out. In fact, I think it is more appealing if you think that people have greedy, nefarious incentives. They'll put more money into something that focuses on the environment, a generalized harm, rather than on things that focus on education plus solar panels or something like that. I think that even if you do get less though, our projects are so much more efficient that that we can still win the debate on that metric because our projects are the things that make material, direct, important impacts, stop people from dying. On these environmental benefits, I've already addressed the fact that I don't think you're likely to only invest in speculative blue sky ideas on our side. But even if you think that is true, I think that can be a benefit for us because if you have the same amount of money that they tell you is already doing more than enough to build enough seawalls, obviously it's not, but like assuming that they are right, and we get a little bit more money going into like 10 potentially really high reward projects, that's awesome because we have more money to take those risks. We have more money to do things well. But also, insufficient engagement with what Eleanor told you about how you are more likely to spend well when you have a lot of money to do it because you're less likely to have a scarcity mindset that makes you only focus on areas that seem potentially really high reward, more localized areas, even if rural areas are crying out more desperate help. They tell you there's going to be diminishing marginal return, there will be diminishing returns from this investment. Obviously, marginal and absolute returns are different. So yes, maybe each dollar goes slightly less effectively, but that's because you have so many of them that their power is is diminished by that. That is still fine because we still get more money. Like if you have a diminishing marginal return, that's okay because you are still making vastly more projects. I don't think that this is sufficient. I think this is really bad economics. Then they tell us, okay, but we can get more environmental benefits out of their out of the projects that they have to stand for, things like farmer training. I think maybe you get benefits out of training farmers. We get more benefits out of giving those farmers seeds that were intensively developed to be climate resistant, to be drought and wheat rust resistant and things like that. And I think that they actually have to cop that their projects are a bit less efficient mitigation, that's the trade-off in the debate. We get more efficient projects and we do them on a bigger scale, but in maybe like a few less places or something like that. They do more of them around everywhere, but they are probably less efficient because solar panels on a school, like which probably only has a few lights running, maybe a generator so it has a fridge, is obviously vastly less good for the environment. But then they say, okay, well you might build like the projects in these developing countries, the schools and hospitals, in an actively environmentally unfriendly way. I'll talk about this in a second when I talk about social development. Firstly, worst case for us, I'm happy to cop that. Like, I think that building schools is still incredibly important. Like Eleanor says, obviously that is not our only mechanism, but I think actually alleviating direct suffering you experience, because otherwise if you're a girl and you can't get education beyond the age of 10 or something like that, so you can never read a book, is actually really valuable. But I think that it's really unlikely that we will build these in really unfriendly ways. Maybe they are slightly less sustainable. Maybe they use slightly less cutting-edge green technology or something like that. But I think that is okay, because these projects often weren't this locus of the biggest environmental harms that occur in these countries. They were hospitals. Obviously, we're not going to start building like a chemical polluting factory or something like that on our side, because no one is talking about that in that debate. I think it is actually really hard to prove that we get a significant worsening of the situation for climate change in a way that can't be traded off for the massive benefits that we get with all of the material that we've given you. Lastly, on social development, they tell us it is incredibly important to focus on the future and that these projects will be unsustainable. I've addressed this in my opening. I think that the risk of unsustainability is very speculative and very far off into the future, and that the concrete benefits of schools and hospitals and roads and education are all really immediate, and that's something that it is worth considering the major win that we have on environmental issues, trading off a small loss perhaps there on environmental sustainability of those projects directly. Then they say you have less money to fund your project. I think that this is unlikely to be true, because I think that we were always talking about the same amount of money coming off the top of this project where it was being spent on solar panels there, being put into our fund. You probably have more. But if they tell you that it is cheaper to build things unsustainably, good. We get even more schools, we get even more hospitals, and again, trade-off we were willing to make. But note that they never engage with the material that when you build things in specifically climate-affected areas, you can overlook bigger and worse suffering in places that happen to be geographically fortunately located, and therefore less climate affected. This is in the info slide. This is something they have to cop. I think that people who suffer from malaria or domestic violence are suffering no matter where they are, and it is better to actually focus on the immediate humanitarian need rather than speculative climate changes. Not that climate change is speculative. Very proud to do this.
Thank you for the affirmative. I'd like to welcome the third negative speaker.
Two parts to this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why adding extra money to the CIF has a very low impact in the debate, and point out all the places that went unmechanised about how the CIF is actually likely to spend this money. Then I'm going to talk about why we get far better, far more impactful projects on our side of the house. On the CIF, I think the biggest assumption underpinning this affirmative team's case is that the CIF is likely to allocate this money well, and they're likely to do heaps of really, really good things. And obviously their case is entirely contingent on this, but there was almost no mechanisation, almost no explanation of how the CIF allocates this money, how the CIF is likely to spend this money or anything. First thing I want to note within this point of clash is that even if you believe none of the other responses in this point of clash, already they have very minimal additional benefit because there is diminishing returns. Obviously the CIF exists on our side of the house as well. Obviously it's the biggest environmental fund in the world currently right now, and so obviously they have the money to do the most impactful, most important things that they actually highlight as examples. So if it's true that Bangladesh needs a seawall to protect from flooding, we have the capital and the ability to use the CIF to spend on that. So all of their high impact examples are already claimed by our side of the house, which is why I think it's so interesting that they didn't want to talk about where the CIF is likely to is where they're likely to spend this in other things. The second thing to say in this point of clash is that we told you that that when they allocate funds, additionally, they're likely to do that in high-risk, high-reward places. Because obviously we've already claimed the important basic things that need to happen on both sides of the house are symmetric. They say, no, they'll just spend it on more development. Yes, development's in their mission statement, but also solving climate change is in their mission statement. We think that the CIF thinks blue skies investment is really valuable and really, really important, and that's why they're likely to spend it there. And the important reason we think this is a bad spending of that additional funds is because it's super, super speculative, because often these projects fail and don't actually come up with any climate outcomes, and we could be helping people in the developing world right now and into the future reduce their emissions, actually have schools that are going to be useful and available to live in. Why do we think these types of very risky, not high payoff investments are very attractive to the CIF? One, they help everyone in the world, not just developing countries. So when they sell it to all of the different voters in the World Bank, obviously they can say, well, this will also benefit you if we're able to get, cloud or carbon capture technology or cloud seeding or things like that. That can benefit everyone in the world if we can make efficient gains in that. So they're likely to invest there. But secondly, it's obviously likely to have much larger impacts in seawalling some area of land that not many people live in, so obviously countries are likely to vote for that. And we already told you why those projects are unlikely to accrue at the end and why they're likely to spend that in bad places. I think the third thing I want to say here is that beyond an assertion to say that they will, the affirmative team does not give any reasons that these big projects in Kenya, big projects, are actually likely to be built. We told you that it is not a matter of funds that these projects are not being built, like carbon capture technology in Kenya, because the CIF is the largest and biggest funder in the world right now. The problem is actually a matter of allocation and whether or not Kenya can pay the loan back, because that's an important gap that the affirmative team misses. Projects from the World Bank are often loans, not grants. Why is that true? One, as Aisha tells you, the donations are voluntary. Big countries with voting power don't want to sink money in continuously over and over, so they prefer to give loans or subsidies where that country also has to make a contribution so that it's cheaper for them. But secondly, you can fund more projects if they pay the loans back, obviously, so they think that it will get more outcomes. The impact of that is that you can't just upscale investment, because obviously it's capped by the sorts of loans that Kenya or any other developing country can pay back. And that's because you can only take on a loan at a certain percentage of your GDP. So if your GDP is small, you can't take on huge amounts of loans. The sorts of projects they say aren't happening but would happen are really, really high cost. And they don't give any reason why the CIF is going to be able to shift their funding model just because of more money, because we told you it's the selfish incentive of big countries is the reason that it won't change. It's a procedural problem, not a financial problem. There was absolutely no response to that. At the end of that point, we proved that all of the big impactful projects that they say they want to have happen are already happening on our side of the house, and the more speculative projects that happen have a very low impact. On the projects that we actually get, I think that the first thing I want to highlight is that there's clearly a big misunderstanding in this debate at second negative when they say, oh, we can build more schools and they're cheaper. But I'm just going to compare both sides of the debate to explain why that's wrong. On our side, if a school costs $9 to build and $1 for a solar panel, that's $10 to build a school. On their side, that school still costs $9. You then have to donate that $1 to the CIF, and then the school costs $10 as well, but now it has no solar panels. If they want to put a solar panel on top of it, it's going to cost more money. So it is clearly not true that they can build more schools or build schools cheaper. I don't know where they got that from. The World Bank is then left with a decision, right? Are they going to leave the school without solar panels, or are they going to raise the cost of the project 10% in projects which obviously don't cost $10 and cost tens of millions, tens of thousands of dollars? Why are both these outcomes absolutely terrible for development? Well, if you have no environmental protections, the projects are just not sustainable. One, it's not just that the project will become obsolete, but the project will be more and more and more expensive over time for this developing country to maintain. If they use non-renewable energy, it's not the case, oh, oil won't run out, so it's not a problem. Obviously, oil's getting more and more and more expensive. They're less able to keep the lights on in the school. They're less able to have kids in the school, and they have to pay more money to do it. They then say, well, we can just retrofit solar panels. One, it is far more expensive to retrofit than it is to have in the first case, because you can build it. Secondly, with what future money are they doing this? They just assume that someone's going to give them money in the future to build solar panels. But three, it's obviously not true for everything and would only work for solar panel. You can't rebuild whole suburbs to put in green spaces that you would otherwise not have. Explain explain how that applies to any other example in this debate. Then let's look at what happens if they still build solar panels, right? The project is significantly more expensive. And the impact of that is that, one, less projects happen on their side of the house. Less development happens on their side of the house. There is a limited funding pool. There's less money to lend to other people when every project gets more expensive. And they weigh this themselves very highly at second when they think they're getting more projects and tell you why it's so important that everyone has access to school. So important that everyone has access to a hospital. So important that everyone has access to a hospital. I think the impacting here is really important because on our side of the house, we reduce the need for those seawalls in the long term when we make all infrastructure in the developing world far cheaper. We reduce carbon right now rather than just prioritising proofing like they seem to do on their side of the house. The second thing is that we keep these developing countries running because the huge price hikes in energy and things like that as a result of climate change have very real effects. In El Salvador, where all of the hospitals were built on fuel generators, the price hikes that happened after the Ukraine war meant they had to turn the generators in hospitals off, which obviously meant that millions of people within that country could not access healthcare. Anyone who was hooked up to something that they needed to live had to die, and that is the reality that happens in developing countries when you do not give them important infrastructure. Obviously, weigh that huge impact of people dying right now, especially given that we get all of their good climate change benefits at the end of this debate. I think that this debate is quite clear. Obviously, we co-opt a huge amount of the benefits they get. The additional benefits are speculative. But they can never protect people in the developing world like we do right now. They give them less development. They give them less ability to adapt for the future.
Is it ready?
Yeah.
Thanks. Two questions in this debate. Firstly, why the CIF does not need more money, and secondly, on sustainable development. Firstly, on why the CIF does not need more money. We give you a contention right back at first negative, that there are many other different types of fund that are able to do climate adaptation and prevention, and so affirmative needs to prove why it has to be in the CIF specifically in order to win this debate at the cost of the huge amounts of sustainable development they will lose. Because we contend that this can be done in other types of funds, but sustainable development cannot occur in other types of funds. What do they say here? They say, oh, the unique reason why it has to be in the CIF instead of other funds that could do other climate projects is because of economies of scale. The first reason we tell you that economies of scale is not likely to occur is because it will go into speculative types of investment instead, and that is unclear how they're ever able to prove that. Sure, maybe having a drought-resistant grain would be nice, but it's unclear if we can actually get a drought-resistant grain for people to have. That's a high-risk, high-reward thing that we think you will just end up wasting money on because of incentives that affirmative never, allocation incentives that affirmative never engage with. But the second thing we would say here is that the high impact examples that they want to claim are really important from the CIF, like sea walls, for example, are symmetric on both sides of the house, as Harper points out in her speech. And the third reason why I do not think economies of scale is enough of a reason for them to meet the high burden of proving why this must be in the CIF is because the types of projects they want to invest in are less needed if we just did sustainable development. I'll explain why in the weighing of the second point of clash. Nextly then, on sustainable development. Why must you prioritise this in this debate? Two reasons. The first will also explain why this is less needed if there's less carbon, and that's because it's important to sustain developmentally. Sure, we might not be running out of oil today or tomorrow in the next 10 years, but we run out slower if we use less oil. So that means that we heat the earth less, that there's less carbon, as we tell you at Grace, to flippant responses at third affirmative. I think it's important to develop sustainably to slow down that risk of climate change overall, to ensure that those things can be developed in a less in blue skies ways that might happen in other funds that affirmative at sometimes pushes there. It means that it would be important to slow down that development, and you should prioritise sustainable development. But secondly, We explained to you that there are principal obligations to develop in the developing world because they have the least current protections and because they are at risk of problems that are caused by the West. Because they lack the individual incentives to do this compared to the West who has incentives to do that. That means that their claims here about more schools or for example, don't work because, sure, people may be vulnerable, but obviously there are scales of vulnerability. So yes, they have malaria, but these people have malaria and floods, and we think those most vulnerable people should be protected from development here. The next thing how do they try to prove that we don't get more sustainable development then? The first is they try to co-opt it, to say that there are incentives to develop sustainably. Even if those apply, we still win this debate in 3 ways. Firstly, we say they don't apply to developers who are the type of people who are who are building the projects, so those are unlikely to be done. Secondly, we say that loan incentives create a return on investment push that mean that people are likely to prioritise the short-term return on investment rather than the long-term of developing sustainably. And thirdly, that these are short-termists. The last thing they push on here is that voter incentives don't exist because they're just bureaucracy, but I would point to Trump, a very intuitive example, who literally just ran on the US spending too much money overseas. Then they say they change the type of projects, but even if that's true, that's unimportant because it's important to have those type of projects to prevent climate change in the long run. And the last thing they say is that they can make them sustainable later. But with literally what money, when they've been loaned a lot of money from the World Bank and they have to pay that back in the long term. Sustainable development never happens in any alternative if the World Bank doesn't pressure people to do it. And it's desperately important for those countries, not as important as funding that literally could be done by any other fund.
Thank you, negative reply. I'd like to open the affirmative reply.
That reply tells you that Donald Trump won the election because he was worried that people were spending too much money in the World Bank. If that is true, which I don't think it is, Donald Trump's actual rhetoric was about people spending too much money on foreign wars and primarily about pulling out of the war in Afghanistan. Note then that I think this underpins the problem in this negative team's case, which is that it lacks specificity to the actual issue being discussed. With that in mind, 2 questions in this reply. Firstly, how do World Bank funding countries respond? Secondly, which development is incentivized inside of 30th? Firstly, on funding countries. This negative team tells you that World Bank voting is outcome-based, and not every country has direct benefits that are tied to putting money into the CIF, so all of them will pull their funding out for political reasons. A couple of clear observations that we just give you on the affirmative team. The first thing that we tell you is that there are obviously incentives that exist to continue funding. That was things like the fact that many countries are actually deeply concerned about the impact of climate change, that many of them are directly impacted by refugee crises, that a lot of them trade with countries that directly need to improve their climate adaptation and capacity to cope with ongoing change, that there are reputational benefits to continuing to fund this, that there are institutional benefits to continuing to fund. their only response comes at second negative, where they tell you, well, not all of these countries have these incentives, and therefore this overrides any of the other ones. But this isn't good enough, because just saying, well, not every country lacks specificity, because we tell you that the countries that do have direct incentives are countries that do trade with large manufacturing giants like India and China. We tell you that Germany doesn't want to take in millions of climate refugees, and obviously that if Germany, one of the most empowered countries in the EU, doesn't want to do that, they can probably wield a great level of institutional power. But we tell you that even if only some countries are subject to these kinds of incentives, they will likely be the countries that could most directly impact the allocation and spending of this funding, and that those incentives obviously existed on either side. You can believe the wash at second negative all you want, but it doesn't actually mean that there's no benefit in this debate. Secondly then, they tell you that there are other funds and that these countries are likely to put their money into those other ones. I've just proven to you why the countries that pull out their money are unlikely to be ones that would have meaningfully tipped the scale in this debate. But secondly, we also tell you that if this trade-off exists, that is fine, because firstly, large-scale carbon capture and solar farming projects anywhere are likely to have a huge globalized environmental benefit that does not simply degrade because it is now happening in the EU instead of in Africa. But secondly, we tell you that even if there is slightly less money in the climate investment fund, that obviously if that money is spent more efficiently, that is a good thing, because just having a lot of money that is spent on constructing, as they admit, shitty hospitals, shitty schools, is probably not a good thing. Secondly then, which development gets incentivized? They say that all of our argumentation is underpinned by the CIF being a good actor. Note that by their own mechanization at Asia, that the CIF has good incentives in either world, this attempt to wash doesn't work, because if they want to rely on empirical observations, many of which are untrue, instead of mechanization, then we must assume that they are also true on the app. Secondly, because we just gave structural reasons in addition to that this was likely to allocate well. Firstly, because the impetus is literally addressing climate change. Secondly, because there was strong internal and organizational knowledge about how best to address it. Thirdly, because obviously there were international norms of things like sustainable development. Fourthly, because there were economic incentives. And note this is where we really pull ahead, because they say blue sky thinking, but also concerned about speculative projects. This is analytically incompatible. This neg needs to pick one and stick with it. Obviously, the CIF wasn't going to do crazy blue sky thinking projects because they didn't want to have funding fight. This last-ditch attempt completely ignores all of the unique benefits that we bring you. Examples: we tell you we can get seagulls. We tell you we can genetically adapt rice to feed literal billions of people. We tell you that we alleviate suffering in a meaningful way that this negative team always runs away from because they know that they can't do it. At the end of this debate, we alleviated so much suffering. We improved our adaptation to climate change. But we were also just the team that had an analytically coherent case. The only way to vote in this debate is out.